Good morning and welcome to Comet Corner. This is a virtual series created by the UT Dallas Office of Research and in partnership with the schools across our campus to host chats with some of our notable alumni and hear how they have taken their research out into the world and made an impact. My name is Enrica Ziller, Research Education Programs and Outreach Manager in the Office of Research at the University of Texas at Dallas. As we move through today's session, I invite you to post questions into the chat for our guest speakers to discuss. Here to guide our conversation and introduce our distinguished alumnus is Amy Spahn. Amy has more than 25 years of experience in the field of early childhood intervention, speech-language pathology, leadership, and strategic philanthropy. As CEO of the Warren Center, she provides oversight to the agency's operations and programs to ensure that its goals are aligned with one mission: to advocate, serve, and empower children and families impacted by developmental delays and disabilities. Under her leadership, the Warren Center has expanded its service area, going from serving 200 children and families each week to serving well over 1,000. She also spearheaded the launch of the agency's clinic therapy services for children over the age of 3 and its Recess program, a respite service for caregivers of children with disabilities. Amy Spahn holds a bachelor degree in communication disorders from James Madison University and a master's degree in communication disorders from the University of Texas at Dallas. So she's an alumna herself. Amy, welcome so much to Comet Corner.
Thank you so much. I'm so welcome. I'm glad to be here. And I'm very excited about our talk today. We have two distinguished doctors in the area of autism research. Our first presenter today will be Dr. Morton Ann Gernsbacher. She received her master's from UTD and her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin in 1983, and was an assistant associate and full professor at the University of Oregon from 1983 to 1992, when she then joined the faculty of University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she's a Vilas Research Professor and the Sir Frederick C. Bartlett Professor of Psychology. She is a Fellow of the American Association for Advancement in Science, the Society of Experimental Psychologists, and American Psychologists Association, the Association Psychology Society, and the American Educational Research Association. Among numerous other leadership positions, she served as president of over 25,000 member Association for Psychological Science. She currently serves on the advisory committee of the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Science Directorate of the National Science Foundation. Dr. Gernsbacher is an award-winning teacher who in 1998 received the Hildell Award of Distinguished Professional Accomplishments, the highest award bestowed by the University of Wisconsin-Madison faculty. Her research has for over 30 years investigated the cognitive neural mechanisms that underlie human communication. She's published over 150 articles and invited chapters of authors. So we're very excited to have her, and let's take it away.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be back, even virtually, at UTD. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to engage with one of my favorite UTD professors, Noah Sasson, about a topic that's near and dear to my heart: questioning who lacks reciprocity by challenging some precarious assumptions about autistic people. For today's event, I was asked to talk about my autism research, which I'm thrilled to do. However, I should be clear that my autism-related research is only one component of my research portfolio, which includes basic memory research that I began back at UTD with the amazing Professor James C. Bartlett. And I've conducted basic attention research, particularly in the realm of attentional suppression and inhibition. But perhaps I'm best known for my language comprehension research, including my first book titled Language Comprehension as Structure Building. I found my way to autism research nearly 20 years ago when a close family member was diagnosed as autistic. And one of my earliest publications in this area, perhaps maybe just the first 10th autism-related publication, set in motion my approach to autism research. That article, titled Toward a Behavior of Reciprocity, published in 2006, questioned the core assumption that autistic people are impaired in reciprocity. In that older article, I reminded readers and myself that reciprocity is by definition a bilateral phenomenon. One dictionary defines reciprocity as, quote, a relation of mutual dependence or action or influence, unquote, as exemplified by the classic reciprocal promise, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Another dictionary definition of reciprocity specifies that reciprocity is, quote, a mode of exchange in which transactions take place between individuals who are symmetrically placed. That is, they are exchanging as equals, neither being in a dominant position, unquote. But when I read the scholarly literature and when I listened to researchers, some clinicians, even some parents, talk about autism and reciprocity, it seemed they forgot that reciprocity is bilateral, that it's a relation of mutual dependence, that it occurs between individuals who are symmetrically placed, who are equals, with neither being in a dominant position. For example, what was initially called the Social Reciprocity Scale, which was published in 2002, contained items inquiring as to whether the autistic child is regarded by other children as odd or weird. And to me, it seemed that this item measures the lack of other children's social or emotional reciprocity, not that of the autistic child. Regarding an autistic child as odd or weird implicates the regarder, not the autistic child, lacks reciprocity, as does the item inquiring whether the autistic child gets teased a lot. How in the world could the occurrence of an autistic child getting teased be construed as a metric that the autistic child, rather than the child who teases them, lacks social or emotional reciprocity? And that, along with numerous other examples, was the purpose of my article titled Toward a Behavior of Reciprocity. I wanted to remind researchers, clinicians, parents, and everyone that reciprocity is a two-way street. Similarly, my article asking, does the autistic brain lack core modules, which was published in 2005, also challenged widely held assumptions. In this case, the assumption that autistic people lacked core brain systems, systems that many researchers have stated makes humans human. That's right. Researchers claim that autistic people lack neural systems that make humans human. How would I like to be described that way? How would you like to be described that way? In 2006 and 2007, I had the honor of serving as president of the 25,000 member Association of Psychological Science. And I used that opportunity to display these ideas to an even broader audience. In one of my APS presidential columns titled On Not Being Human, I challenged those researchers who had made claims that autistic children and adults lack mechanisms that researchers claimed were uniquely human. And some of those researchers were really big names in psychology. And another of my APS presidential columns, this one titled How to Spot Bias in Research, I called attention to the bias autism researchers can hold when they interpret their results. In another APS presidential column titled Reaching for Relevance, I encouraged all researchers to refrain from reaching too far in claiming that their results are relevant to autism. In my column titled Eye of the Beholder, which harkened back to my absolute favorite episode of The Twilight Zone, I demonstrated how if the world was predominantly autistic, it would be the non-autistic people who would be considered odd, weird, most likely disordered, and might get bullied and teased. In neurodiversity, I encouraged researchers to respect differences as diversity, even neural or brain differences. In the true meaning of research participation, I shared how enriched my research program became when I began including autistic people not just as research subjects, but as true collaborators who generated the ideas for our collaborative studies, as exemplified by 3 articles I published with Michelle Dawson, including 2 articles for which Michelle, who is an incredibly smart and talented autistic Canadian about my age, served as first author. My collaboration with Namira Akhtar, who is Muslim and who appreciates a culture in which eye contact can be considered impolite and during some holidays unholy, led to 2 papers in which we challenged the altar on which eye contact has been deified in autism treatment and research. And these articles led to my writing a paper in Nature titled Autism Without Borders, which challenged Western-centric autism researchers and practitioners to work beyond our own cultural biases. In a chapter titled A Conspicuous Absence of Scientific Leadership, the Illusory Epidemic of Autism, which was published in a book titled Leadership and Discovery. And the book included other authors such as astronauts and Nobel physicists. I recounted how much resistance I had met years earlier when I had published an article titled 3 Reasons Not to Believe in an Autism Epidemic. I'm still stumped how well-known autism researchers who knew that, for example, vaccines didn't cause autism, failed to speak out at the time. On the other hand, my earlier article led to my receiving death threats and other antagonisms, so in some way I could understand it. As I mentioned earlier, I'm primarily known as a language researcher, and Dean Small knows me in that regard, and that's the area in which I received my doctoral training. I've applied that training to the study of language and autism in a few ways. For example, and perhaps one of the most replicated autism findings I've published to date, my colleagues and I demonstrated that infant and toddler oral and manual motor skills, such as blowing raspberries and reaching into a 1-year birthday cake, could predict which autistic children would later develop speech fluency. In another article, I demonstrated that autistic toddlers are no less likely than non-autistic toddlers to use mentalizing language and emotion and social related language. When the autistic and the non-autistic toddlers are equated for their non-mentalizing, non-social, non-emotional language skills. A similar message ran through my article, Fast Mapping is a Laboratory Task, Not a Cognitive or Social Cognitive Capacity. And a similar message was heralded in Sarah Pripas-Capit's in my article, Who's Missing the Point? A commentary on claims that autistic persons have a specific deficit in figurative language comprehension. Sarah Pripas-Capit, by the way, is a best-selling novelist whose kid-lit books feature autistic protagonists, including a knuckleball-throwing Little League girl pitcher. With 2 neurodivergent co-authors, Emily Morrison and Ibby Grace, we summarize these and other findings in a chapter published in the Neurobiology of Language and an article published in the Annual Review of Linguistics. From echolalia and pronoun reversal to, quote, theory of mind narratives, we show that language can develop atypically in autism, but not necessarily aberrantly. I've also used my training in language to challenge the use of language about autistic people. For example, in the use of person-first language in scholarly writing may accentuate stigma, I analyzed the texts of more than 5 million books, 25 million scientific abstracts, and 150 million scholarly articles to demonstrate that scholarly writing uses person-first language more often for children with versus without disabilities, more often for children versus adults with disabilities, and most often for children with the most stigmatized disabilities. For example, the scholarly literature is much more likely to use the term gifted children with autism than the term autistic children with giftedness, suggesting that person-first language might contribute to the stigma. And special needs is an ineffective euphemism. We demonstrated that children and adults who were described as having special needs, rather than described as having a disability or having a specific disability, such as autism, were rated significantly less positively. In More Shared Responsibility for More Appropriate Communication, which was published in ASHA's Perspectives, I examined 100 scholarly articles to demonstrate that researchers, parents, and clinicians frequently place the burden of, quote, more appropriate communication on disabled children, rather than sharing the responsibility. In this article, we answer the question, do puzzle pieces in autism puzzle piece logos evoke negative associations? And the answer is yes. And we concluded that if an organization's intention is to evoke positive associations to autism, then the organization probably should avoid using puzzle piece imagery. In Infantilizing Autism, we analyzed autism societies and autism charities' definitions of autism to demonstrate that they frequently refer to only autistic children at the expense of ignoring or infantilizing autistic adults. In this forum about mirror neurons, remember them? They were pretty hot about 10 or 15 years ago. I reviewed scores of studies to conclude that the evidence that autistic people lack or have broken mirror neurons is not viable. An homage to Banksy. And more recently, Melanie Yergo and I conducted an exhaustive analysis of the claim that autistic people lack a theory of mind. We concluded that the claim is empirically questionable and society harmful. In research that parallels that of Professor Noah Sasson, who is a pillar in autism research, we found that specificity, context, and reference groups matter when assessing autistic traits. For example, when responding to the item, I enjoy being around people, autistic people are much more likely to report that they enjoy being around people if the people are specified as autistic people, whereas non-autistic people respond in the exact opposite way. We also empirically demonstrated that autistic people are just as motivated to enhance themselves, that is, engage in self-enhancement by telling positive things about themselves, like I was asked to do today during this conversation hour, as non-autistic people are. All of which can be summarized by remembering to accept diverse brains and being aware of the stigma that can arise from even we psychological scientists. And I believe a good way to attenuate that stigma is to address group differences rather than deficits. And I believe that's a responsibility that should be shared equally by non-autistic parents, researchers, and should not be carried solely by autistic people. Because after all, reciprocity is indeed a two-way street. Thank you so much for your attention to my brief presentation today. Thank you again for inviting me here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gernsbacher, for your very enlightening information and new research on this area. So we greatly appreciate it. I now would like to introduce Dr. Noah Sasson, who studies intrinsic and extrinsic mechanisms of social disability and autism. Historically, his works focused on one intrinsic mechanism in particular, social cognition, which refers to the perception, processing, and interpretation of social information. More recently, his work is highlighting extrinsic mechanisms of social disability and autism, including the perceptions, biases, and behaviors of non-autistic people that contribute to poor social and functional outcomes for autistic adults. Dr. Sasson earned his bachelor's degree in English literature at Franklin and Marshall College and his PhD in developmental psychology at the University of North Carolina. Welcome, Dr. Sasson.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thanks, Morton, for a wonderful talk. That Mount Rushmore picture notwithstanding, but I loved your talk, and I really appreciated the focus on reciprocity. And I don't think I'd really thought about it in this light before, but it does strike me that the big emphasis in autism research on deficits can be seen in one way as reflecting a lack of reciprocity, or at least a lack of an appreciation of other ways of being, or a failure to try to understand autistic differences in thinking and behavior on their own terms instead of terms that we impose upon them. Many autistic people, of course, do need supports and accommodations to various degrees, but I think your talk helps highlight how often non-autistic people, including many autism researchers, are very quick to judge any deviation from the norm as problematic and in need of repair. So this could include things like stimming behavior or reduced eye contact, which you mentioned in your talk, which may make some non-autistic people uncomfortable or be perceived negatively, but they could have adaptive or coping value for people who are neurologically different, who might have sensory sensitivities or more easily overloaded by stimulation. So, I mean, often I think it's important to take a step back and before deeming such differences as in need of fixing or repair, that we take time for some reciprocity. And first and foremost in that process is listening and prioritizing the testimonies and needs of autistic people themselves, and they should be at the forefront of some of this conversation. But for me personally, in my research, where I do focus on social disability, the lack of reciprocity really is encapsulated by this phrase, social deficits, and what we mean by social deficits. There's an inherent tension to me and an inconsistency in that term, because a deficit, of course, is perceived as an individual level characteristic. It's something where someone is classified as lacking some normative trait or ability that's valued and presumed to be the right way of being. And that word social, of course, by definition, is not an individual characteristic. It's a process requiring more than one person. So in a sense, when we attribute a social deficit to a single person, we're reducing a complex relational variable to the individual level and attributing blame, as you said, for difficulties in social interaction to the fault of one person rather than to some mismatch in social understanding between two people. And it's kind of ironic, given the field that I come out of, studying social cognition, that the studies of these social deficits really are often not very social at all, right? If you dig into the literature, social understanding is often measured in kind of artificial or reductive ways, like having people sit alone at a computer terminal and choose what emotions being expressed on the faces of people, or sometimes just the eye region of the face in isolation, or asking them what some character in a vignette might be feeling or thinking, or using eye tracking to see where they're looking on the screen and if it's different from non-autistic people. I've done a lot of that work myself, and yes, on average, autistic participants do score lower on these standardized assessments than non-autistic controls. I say on average because there's a lot of variability, with many autistic participants performing equivalently or even better than some controls, and often these group level effects aren't even that large. And we have to say that these tasks also privilege non-autistic ways of social understanding as being the correct ways on these tasks, as your recent paper on theory of mind measurement demonstrates. But yes, findings from these studies suggest that at the group level, autistic people do often prioritize and engage with social information in non-normative ways. It's certainly true that autistic people can differ socially from non-autistic people. They may differ in how they use gaze, how they express themselves non-verbally in the face or in their voice or through gestures. They might have different conversational preferences, like their desire or lack thereof for social chit-chat, or their preference for discussing topics more explicitly rather than having to read between the lines that's inherent in a lot of non-autistic people's social interaction. But here's the thing, my work recently and work by other people in this area are now documenting pretty conclusively that non-autistic people often also struggle to understand what autistic people are thinking and feeling. That misunderstanding goes both ways, with non-autistic people demonstrating, I guess, social cognitive problems about autistic minds. But of course, non-autistic people are rarely labeled as having a deficit in that regard. And so what that really says to me is that a deficit on the part of autistic people is only relative to non-autistic norms. It's not some deficit in absolute terms. That's something we've reified or constructed here. And one way you can show that is by comparing social interaction quality between two autistic people and compare it to how interaction occurs between autistic and non-autistic people. If a deficit model was correct, you'd predict those interactions between two autistic people to be really bad because it has double the number of people with social deficits involved, right? But we in our lab and others, such as Catherine Crompton in the UK, have found just the opposite. Social interaction is often, but not always, enhanced when autistic people interact. It's when autistic and non-autistic people are interacting that you see a reduction in rapport and effective communication. Autistic people in our interaction studies even report disclosing more about themselves when they're interacting with another autistic person, and they express greater interest in future interaction with autistic partners compared to non-autistic ones, while non-autistic people, not surprisingly, prefer interactions with other non-autistic people. So I think a lot of research and clinical work starts with this assumption that what is normative is ideal and that deviations from that are in need of remediation. And that's what a deficit approach kind of does. It reduces complex phenomenon like social behavior to abilities like social skill or social cognition that are presumed to be quantifiable on some single standard where people can be rank ordered on a linear scale from good to bad. But our work recently is showing that it doesn't often work like that in practice. And we've conducted studies where we measure people's social cognitive abilities using standardized tests or assess their social skill based on normative standards. And then they meet other people and get to know each other. And sometimes both those people who are meeting are autistic, sometimes one is and the other isn't. And when the conversation is over, we have them evaluate each other and the quality of their interaction. And guess what we find? We find that measures of the autistic person's social abilities don't really translate in predictable ways to the outcomes of those interactions. An autistic person's social cognition, social skill, even their social motivation are largely unassociated with how they're evaluated and how they evaluate their conversation partners. In contrast, maybe ironically, we find that it's the social cognitive abilities of non-autistic people that are more predictive of those social outcomes interacting with autistic people. We find that those that have the highest rated social cognition often are evaluated less favorably by autistic people, likely because they are engaging in the social interaction in a way that the autistic person doesn't prefer, right? So it's true that because we live in a predominantly non-autistic world, that autistic people often have much of the burden placed on them to accommodate to the non-autistic standards rather than vice versa, but it doesn't inherently have to be that way. That burden is one reason autistic adults often feel the need to present themselves in less autistic ways to avoid discrimination. And not coincidentally, autistic adults often, very frequently, develop mental health difficulties like anxiety and depression and experience suicidality at much higher rates than non-autistic people. And the reason autistic adults often try to camouflage their autism is we have found, for instance, in our studies that non-autistic people are very quick to judge autistic differences almost instantly and report greater reluctance to engage with them socially. It takes very little social information for non-autistic people to make this judgment. We find it even from a static photograph or an isolated recording of their voice. What that means in practice is that above and beyond any difficulty autistic people experiencing interacting with non-autistic people because of the differences they have in social communication understanding, they may face social exclusion and discrimination because of how those differences are perceived even before an interaction begins. All right. And so just in summary, we can open up a dialogue here. I think what the literature is starting to say to me is that social disability emerges at the intersection of a person and their environment. It's not inherent of the person or of the environment, but some misalignment between the person's characteristics and environmental demands. But to this point, most autism research and treatment largely focuses exclusively on the person. That's what the diagnostic process, of course, emphasizes. And I think in some respects, that's held us back in actually improving outcomes for autistic people, which is all of our goals. Okay, so with that, I don't know, Morton, if you want to react to that in some way, or we can talk about connections between your work and mine.
Sorry, I was going to say that was wonderful. Noah, thank you for sharing that reflection as well as making those connections. And I like the Mount Rushmore picture anyway, because it's true that you were the one who pioneered that work of saying, let's see what happens when autistic people communicate in vivo. Rather than, for example, in my research, we took kind of the easy way out, and we just said respond to these items on a standardized measure, and we manipulated the items like I enjoy being with people versus I enjoy being with autistic people. I enjoy being, but you had actual communication, actual interaction, and I think in that way you really are a pioneer in that line of research.
And I do want to credit the inspiration for those kind of works, because that didn't come out of my lab. There's a strong and rich history, especially of testimony from autistic people themselves and first-person narratives, and increasingly autistic researchers who are challenging some of these assumptions. And those work were inspired primarily by a sociologist named Damian Milton, who has developed a kind of sociological explanation for miscommunication between autistic and non-autistic people. And that work that you're describing from my lab was meant to try to empirically test some of the ideas brought forth by that framework. And it turns out that we are seeing a lot of confirmatory evidence empirically, and not coincidentally, it aligns really well with a lot of anecdotal reports from autistic people themselves, who feel when they actually engage with the autism literature that it's often dehumanizing and reducing aspects of their disability to things that they feel, not always, but they can feel is not a helpful way to frame what's causing them difficulties.
Thank you for bringing up Damian Milton's work, because we should give a big shout out to that work and to his theoretical position called the double empathy problem. As I alluded to in my presentation, probably as long time as there have been assumptions and assertions about autistic people lacking reciprocity, there have been assertions and assumptions about autistic people lacking empathy and not understanding how another person feels and not feeling the way another person feels. And I will say, even before I became interested in autism, the reality is most of us can't feel the way another person feels. I mean, when someone's spouse passes away, if your spouse has not passed away, you can imagine what that person would feel like, but you can't. And there's a really interesting essay by Jay Sinclair that predates much of this work about empathy, and basically says the same thing, that no one really knows how another person feels. It's just autistic people are earnest and honest enough to tell you that they don't understand how another person feels. And so the back to the double empathy, the whole notion that it's only autistic people who lack empathy rather than non-autistic people who lack empathy for autistic people, because they can't understand how they act and feel. And I can tell you, when I first began reading the literature and seeing things like only autistic children and robots do X, or X, Y is your uniquely human behavior. Autistic children don't do this. Even as someone who is a non-autistic but still neurodivergent person, my antenna went up. I could not even imagine how we could be describing anyone in those terms. Noah, you want to tell us a little bit more about work that you've done that dovetails with Damian Milton's double empathy problem? I know you have this gorgeous new article that's specifically written for children, which I admire quite a bit.
Well, that article, yes, which I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested, was led by Catherine Crompton, who I briefly mentioned in my comments. She's a researcher in the UK who also has been testing this double empathy idea. And one fascinating study she did was basically a telephone game between groups of autistic people or groups of non-autistic people or mixed groups between autistic and non-autistic people, where you basically tell some information to somebody else who passes it on to the next person, and at the end of the chain, you see how much of the of that message was maintained. And what she finds is that if you only have autistic people do it, they maintain just as much information as groups of non-autistic people. It's when you have these mixed chains where it's alternating from autistic to non-autistic people that you see a dramatic breakdown in the quality of the maintenance of information communication. So that, I think, is a great demonstration of this double empathy idea. Double empathy doesn't specifically just mean feeling for another person or understanding where they're coming from, but it's a whole host of differences in communication and understanding and expectations of how to communicate and what information somebody needs or will prioritize. And it may be that because autistic people share certain kind of neurological cognitive sensibilities, that they may demonstrate greater affiliation oftentimes, although autistic people are all individuals and there are many ways that they can differ from each other. So not all autistic people get along, just like not all non-autistic people get along. But as a general principle in social psychology, we tend to affiliate and prefer the company of people we share important characteristics with. And that's being borne out in some of these studies testing double empathy. So in my work, I think our initial contribution was really just demonstrating how against the 8-ball autistic people are in non-autistic environments, how quickly they are judged negatively and can affect their likelihood for inclusion, or even lead non-autistic people to make incorrect social cognitive judgments about autistic people, maybe about how competent they are. Imagine an autistic person in a job interview, for instance, who presents socially differently, and that confers all sorts of implications to the potential employer that are inaccurate in the judgments that they're making about the person's capabilities at that job. And so one recent direction that we've gone, a doctoral student in my lab, Desi Jones, designed a treatment, quote unquote, for non-autistic people, basically saying how much can we change people's explicit biases and implicit biases about autism by presenting with them factual information or first-person narratives of autistic people about the challenges they face and what would be helpful for them, introduce concepts like neurodiversity that can be more respectful to autistic differences. And she finds, for instance, that people going through that training end up demonstrating less of these negative first impressions subsequently with autistic people. They demonstrate greater autism knowledge, and they demonstrate greater interest in future interaction with autistic people. However, before you get all excited about this approach, it had no effect whatsoever on their implicit biases about autism. If you measure implicit biases, they still associate autism with negative characteristics. So in one respect, this training may just be affecting social desirability. Like they get the clue, okay, I can't be a jerk about autistic differences, and this is what how I'm supposed to act. But maybe it's working on a deeper level as well. However, those underlying associations, which probably build up over decades and decades of internalizing signals from popular media or from experiences you've had in the world, are really hard to break down. So the hope, though, is from a double empathy framework with greater familiarity and association with different ways of thinking and you can bridge that gap in miscommunication. Generally speaking, it's only really recently that we're starting to have a lot more inclusion of autistic students in mainstream schools and colleges. UTD, for instance, has a lot of autistic students, and having an interaction between autistic and non-autistic students, especially from an early age where it's more of a normative experience, may, to some degree, lessen some of the miscommunication between, but we don't know yet. That hasn't been empirically tested to my knowledge.
Yeah. Amy, feel free to jump in with other questions.
Yes. Well, the first question that we had, you basically just answered. It was saying that your research said that people, non-autistic individuals and not autistic individuals prefer to speak together, and non-autistic also. And they were asking, have you identified that non-autistic individuals can better engage with autistic individuals, and how can they do that? And your research is showing, Dr. Sasson, that giving them some clues ahead of time can help, but that doesn't necessarily mean it changes the
well, optimistically, we also do find there's a lot of variability in how non-autistic people respond to autistic people. It's not uniform, so I don't want to paint with a broad brush the way we often do in autism research about declaring autistic people as lacking theory of mind when you have so much variability on these tasks to begin with. But for instance, we find that people who do have more familiarity with autism or who have more factual knowledge about autism tend to express I don't want to say more favorable impressions of autistic people, because it still lags behind how they rate non-autistic people, but it is an improvement over people who do not have that knowledge and familiarity. So that gives us some insight that perhaps familiarity, experience, knowledge can be a mechanism for change to some degree. But whether that works at a deeper level than just these kind of explicit judgments, oftentimes we think perhaps people are just being cued that, oh, I'm evaluating somebody who's different. I was just asked all these questions about autism. I'm going to be a little bit more generous and sympathetic. And in fact, we do find that when you tell non-autistic people they're evaluating somebody on the autism spectrum, they rate them more favorably, meaning that they're a little bit more generous in how they evaluate people, because likely they now have an explanation for behaviors or presentations they deem to be different. Whereas in the absence of that information, they don't do so.
Awesome. The next question we got is, what do you think are the barriers to these assumptions, empirical observations about autism being incorporated into conceptualizations of autism that inform diagnosis and available supports?
That's a big one. So Noah, if you're cogitating on it, feel free to go right ahead. I just want to, first of all, mention in terms of available supports, I feel like I want to just clarify that when I talk about these issues with reciprocity or the like, that I don't believe that that should detract ever from the needed and necessary support and accommodations and interventions that all autistic people deserve. And so I want to clarify that we can challenge some of these assumptions, but that, at least for me, and I think Noah agrees as well, should never, ever detract from the absolute necessity for much more improved and increased support, resources, and accommodations. So I'll take the easy one first. In terms of accommodations, that when we think about accommodations for other disabilities, we think there's usually kind of two models in my head. There are accommodations like curb cuts and captions, which, although designed for people with a specific disability, curb cuts for those with mobility impairments and captions for deaf and hard of hearing, actually improve the world for everyone. I mean, the last time you were pushing a stroller or dragging a suitcase to the airport, or if you were pushing a dolly or the like, you took advantage of the fact that people with disabilities worked hard and long to get curb cuts on our major streets. And captions, I've published articles on that as well, that captions help everyone. Captions help hearing children learn to read. Captions help people who are watching a video in their not native language. So those kinds of accommodations can help everyone. And I think that there are some good accommodations that we could more frequently offer the autistic community that would indeed help everyone. For example, tagless clothes are a super positive. I am someone with very high tactile sensitivity, and the thought that someone would sew into my t-shirt a scratchy big tag and that would be a positive is beyond me. So things like hearing protectors, hearing defenders, the ability to use those in noisy environments, lighting. I loved working with Enrica to put this event together, and I had the advantage of seeing her on camera, and her office lighting is ideal It's subtle. It's not the glaring fluorescent lighting that can be so annoying to so many autistic people. And the list goes on. So I think that there's a wave of accommodations that we as a society could agree we're going to implement across the board, just like we did with captions and curb cuts. And that will help not just autistic people, but non-autistic people. But then there are accommodations like Braille and sign language, which are unique to a disability. And they might even be unique to a person in that regard. And what we need to do as a society is get to the point where we are almost for sign language, where, for example, during the hurricane season, when we see governors and mayors announce on the news about dangerous situations, we also see the sign language interpreter, and we're okay with that. We don't think, oh, that looks weird or funny or whatever. We don't say that's not fair. That's just for some small segment of the population. We're okay. And I think that we as a society can move ourselves to, first of all, find out what would be equivalents, autistic equivalents of sign language for to support autistic people, and then put the resources behind those accommodations, and then as a society be okay with it, and in fact maybe even value it as we do when we see the sign language interpreters.
And I would just add, I think one way we could move forward in this regard is, as I mentioned in my comments, is to foreground the voices of autistic people themselves. I mean, autism research historically has been largely led by people who aren't on the spectrum themselves. And in fact, many autism researchers, ironically, have very little interaction with autistic people. They may, you know, work on their data sets that were based on autistic participants that they didn't recruit or test, and they write papers and grants to try to appease non-autistic reviewers and funders. And so really the incentive structure in autism research isn't always to be responsive to the needs of the autistic community. And I think that is reflected in some funding priorities, where if you look at how autism research is funded in this country, it's predominantly funded towards studies of neurobiology, of the brain, of genetics, other things like that, which of course there's value in that scientific information. But if you poll autistic community, they tend to emphasize needs for translational research, needs for services, needs for lifespan research, and that's not reflected in where the money and energy is often going to. So if we, as non-autistic researchers, want to know what autistic people need to improve their lives, incorporate them in your research process. Have autistic students in your lab, train autistic scientists to be PIs of their own labs. And that's unfortunately pretty uncommon these days. It's very easy, even in my position as a tenure professor, a lot of my responsibilities is sitting at a computer and writing, or teaching students, or service to the department, or whatever. And I have to make a point to engage with and collaborate with autistic researchers, or I get a lot of feedback online and over social media, and I love that. Sometimes it's critical, and that makes me reflect. And I have autistic students in my lab, and all of that, I think, is going to help move the field forward. It would be very odd if everybody who studies, feminism were men, right? That just seems counterintuitive to us. Yet in autism research, we don't often have autistic people at the forefront of the field. And that, thankfully, I think is starting to change.
So no, I just want to dovetail real quickly on one of the things that you mentioned, because you mentioned about the large autistic community of students at UT Dallas, which is wonderful. And one of the things that makes me love UTD even more. And I urge textbook authors to also, they talk about sensitivity readers in the world of publishing for novels and the like. They use sensitivity readers. So if you're going to write about deaf children, you would have someone who is aware and sensitive to deaf children read. I would urge university textbook authors to enlist the resources of autistic college students, because I cannot imagine anything worse than being in a college classroom paying $90 for a college textbook and then reading that you lack a theory of mind, and that theory of mind is what makes us human. My 2 cents.
I'm going to skip to another question. As a speech therapist myself, another speech therapist reached out and was wondering both researchers' opinions on your so-called social skills training for autistic people. In her opinion, or his opinion, it's ableist and denial of the double empathy problem and diversity in social intelligence research. As an alum of UTD, will your research lead to changing SLP practices?
Go for it, Noah. Yeah, go right ahead.
In addition to that, I'd say the evidence base for the effectiveness of some of those psychosocial interventions, especially for autistic adolescents and adults, is pretty thin. I mean, you can see some evidence of like a parent or informant report noticing changes, or people performing better on standardized tests of assessment. But when you really take a step back and look at translational benefits, do they generalize to better social outcomes, personal, professional outcomes for autistic people? There really isn't strong evidence there. And that may be, in my opinion, because of an overemphasis on this idea of social deficits. So a social skills program, by definition, is trying to normalize autistic people to demonstrate or think and act in ways that are more neurotypical, right? That's might be beneficial in some sense of increasing understanding of neurotypical norms among autistic people. But in a sense, you are trying to train people to act against their authentic selves in ways that are inconsistent to how they would naturally feel. And this is probably not the intent, but it is a way of implying to autistic people that their way of being is not right, is not valued. It is likely going to lead to some kind of internalized stigma as well, and encourage things like camouflaging and hiding autistic ways of being for fear of discrimination. The reason people do it is because they have a long record of negative consequences of demonstrating their autistic tendencies, and they're trying to avoid being bullied. I mean, autistic kids are just trying to make it through the day like everyone else. They just have increasing challenges to be able to do that. So I think potentially over the long term, some of these training programs could broaden their idea of what are we treating here? Is it our goal to actually change the person so that they are received better by the social environment? Or do we need a more holistic approach of changing that social environment and making everybody a little bit more understanding and inclusive of differences? It's not easy. Obviously, we're not going to do social skills training for the entire planet. So I think the way this happens is through cultural change, the ways we talk about autism, ways autism is portrayed in the media. There are portrayals of autism all over popular television shows. Many are highly stereotypical and cast non-autistic people in the roles, and often they're just there as a foil for the growth of the non-autistic protagonist. Look at Rain Man, for instance, right? It's all about Tom Cruise improving as a human being through his relationship with Raymond. So yeah, I don't have an easy answer to that, but I agree that some aspects of social skills training have some problematic framing involved in it, and may not always result in, I think it's well intentioned, I just don't think it always gets us to where we want to be.
Dr. Gernsbacher, do you have any?
Sure. And I would just add, I agree very much with Noah. I think I would just add that for all of us, and particularly for people with disabilities, there are needed training to get us to do the things that we want to do. And that should be available and accessible. I think one of the problems with social skills training is that it starts, as Noah's described, with non-autistic people saying, here are the things we want you, the autistic person, to do and to be, rather than the autistic person saying, I'd really like some training in X. I'd like to feel more comfortable in Y situation. I'd like Z. And again, coming back to the mantra in disability rights, which is nothing about us without us, if a social skills training program was designed by disabled people, in this case by autistic people, I think it would have more value than the systems, the training programs that we've seen so far, which are designed by non-autistic people, thinking this is what the direction that we'd like for you to go.
Awesome. Another question is, a lot of the recent DEP empirical work, as far as I've seen, is focused primarily on autistic/non-autistic identity. We know that interaction can be impacted by the dyad being of the same compared to different genders. We also see impacts when a dyad contains members of the same compared to different racial identities. How should empirical work on the DEP move forward to include and look at aspects of identities beyond just neurotype? Example, the experience of the Black autistic people can be often very different than the experience of white autistic people.
Yeah, absolutely. And gender fluidity and sexuality and different sexualities and ethnic, and the list goes on. And I think that we see, even for the more progressive autism research, that it's characterized by the same challenges and problems that the less progressive autism research is, which is that it is not truly inclusive, that it's much more likely to be with majority race, ethnicity, sexualities, and genders. And the whole issue of those intersections and intersectionality is, to me, one of the most fascinating. I wish I had another 30 years in my research career to study, because that would fascinate me as much as anything, to understand the true meaning of intersectionality with regard to autism, sexuality, race, ethnicity.
Oh, I totally agree with you, Morton. It's a limitation in my research. It's very difficult to get the sample sizes you need and use the kind of experimental design you need to isolate these kind of autistic, non-autistic effects that we were examining. And in that study I mentioned, those were only men. We didn't have the capacity to include women as well, not only because it's more difficult for us to recruit autistic women, but because that introduces another layer of manipulation, that you have to double and triple your sample size. And unfortunately, I mean, it's a huge limitation, because obviously autism is only one aspect of identity. It does intersect with many other salient characteristics of identity. Autism isn't the only salient characteristics for non-autistic people to know. People interact differently with people of other races or other genders, and that complexity is what makes this kind of research so challenging, because it really takes enormous amounts of resources to be able to do this work well, at least in an experimental context. That's not to say there isn't great qualitative work in this area. And speaking of these important kind of intersection issues, I think Desi in my lab has brought in research from other fields within social psychology about racial prejudice or gender prejudice, and how those biases can be alleviated through different designs. That's what helped inspire the design of her initial study. But that's not to say, it's the end all or be all. There's many ways that we could try to examine this and to reflect the complexity of human life, which isn't just a single characteristic versus a different one. We all have multiple identities at the same time.
Well, I want to thank you. I think we're running out of time, so I just want to thank Dr. Gernsbacher and Dr. Sasson so much for this enlightening information, and I think it will truly change how therapy happens in the future. I hope it does anyways. So I just want to thank everybody for coming.
Thank you, Amy, for the wonderful moderation.
Yes, thank you so much. This was great fun. I enjoyed it.
Indeed. And audience, thank you for joining us today. Our team would really appreciate any feedback you might have about the Comet Corner series. Please click through the survey link found in the Q&A chat to share your thoughts with us. Also, if you'd like to support current and future comments and research like you've heard about today, please consider making a gift during Comet's Giving Days, which is going on today and tomorrow. UT Dallas community is coming together to make a cosmic impact. Learn more and donate online at givingdays.utdallas.edu. Everyone, have a great summer, and we hope that you can join us in the fall for more Comet Corner series sessions. Thanks. Have a great afternoon.